He was just 19, full of life, and headed home after a late-night shift at a small-town diner. But Brandon Keller never made it back. For over 3 decades, his disappearance haunted his family, tormented a quiet North Carolina town, and baffled detectives, until one piece of forgotten evidence unearthed the truth. What happened that night in 1987 wasn't random. It was calculated. And the person behind it all had been hiding in plain sight. This is the story of how a cold case burned back to life, and the conviction that came decades too late. He clocked out at 11:42 p.m., waved goodbye to his co-workers and walked into the night. His car was found abandoned hours later, but Brandon Keller was never seen again. Ashwood, North Carolina, 1987. A town with less than 6,000 people and where everyone knew your name. Life was slow here. Predictable. Safe. At least, that's what people believed until the night Brandon Keller vanished without a trace. Brandon was 19. The kind of kid everyone liked. He worked part-time at Ollie's Diner, the local burger joint off Route 42. On the night of May 18th, Brandon was covering the late shift, working alongside 2 co-workers and the night manager. It was a Monday, quiet, uneventful. He cleaned the grill, took out the trash and helped lock the doors. Security footage, black and white and grainy, showed him leaving through the back at 11:42 p.m. His 1982 red Dodge Dart was parked behind the alley. He waved to the manager, said he'd see her Wednesday, and disappeared into the darkness. By morning, that Dodge Dart was still sitting there, driver's side door slightly ajar, keys missing and Brandon gone. At first it didn't set off alarm bells. Maybe he went out with friends. Maybe he crashed at someone's house. Maybe, just maybe, he ran off with that girl he'd been quietly dating. Rumor had it she was from out of town, someone he met through a friend at the community college. But by 10 a.m., Brandon's mother, Linda Keller, had already called the sheriff's office. She knew her son. He was respectful, predictable, and never missed curfew without calling. He wasn't the type to vanish. Sheriff Donald Treadwell dispatched deputies to canvass the area. The diner staff said the night was normal. No arguments. No strange customers. No problems. But the parked car raised suspicion. It wasn't vandalized, but the inside was oddly clean, too clean according to the lead investigator. There wasn't even a coffee cup or a receipt. It was as if someone had wiped it down. For 48 hours, the police treated it as a standard missing persons case. No signs of foul play. No body. No crime. Then came the report. A jogger had been running a trail near Ashwood Creek when she found a torn button-down shirt caught in a fence. It was Brandon's. His name tag was still pinned to the collar. 100 yards further, investigators found a single cigarette butt. Brandon didn't smoke. The area was combed for days. Bloodhounds were brought in. Volunteers searched nearby woods, ditches, and abandoned barns. But nothing else was found. By week 3, the case had gone cold. There was no suspect, no motive, no physical evidence tying anyone to Brandon's disappearance. Just an eerie silence and a mother who refused to let her son be forgotten. Linda Keller turned her grief into a mission. She printed flyers. She called television stations. She pushed the sheriff's office relentlessly. But the 80s weren't like today. There was no national database to flag DNA, no viral social media campaign to keep the story alive. Within 6 months, the town had moved on. But Linda hadn't. Every year on May 18th, she held a candlelight vigil outside Ollie's Diner. Sometimes only 2 or 3 people showed. Other times the parking lot was full. But Linda never missed a year. Theories surfaced over time. Some said Brandon had been targeted by someone jealous. Maybe a coworker, maybe someone in town who envied how easily he got along with people. Others believed he'd been lured out of town by someone he trusted, never suspecting a trap. One woman, a retired waitress named Dee, claimed she saw Brandon arguing with a man in a dark pickup truck weeks before the disappearance. She remembered the man had a beard and wore a denim vest with a Confederate patch on the back. But no one could identify him. Her description never matched anyone from Ashwood. And then, silence. For years. Fast forward to 2021. Ashwood had changed. Ollie's Diner had become a Starbucks. Sheriff Donald Treadwell had retired, replaced by a young, tech-savvy sheriff named Eli Boudreau. The Keller house was now empty. Linda passed away in 2019, still without answers. But Brandon's case file sat in a box labeled Cold Case 87K, tucked inside the evidence locker. It would have stayed there, if not for a federal DNA initiative pushing departments nationwide to reprocess old evidence with new technology. When Boudreau's team reopened the box, they found the cigarette butt collected near the trail in 1987, long dried and degraded, but preserved in a plastic sleeve. It had never been tested. Back then, DNA analysis was barely usable, and the evidence had been considered low priority. Now it was a game changer. The lab technicians ran the sample through CODIS, the national DNA database. And within weeks, they had a hit. The name that came back wasn't from Ashwood. It was from over 800 miles away. A convicted murderer serving life in a Florida penitentiary, Raymond Duval. Arrested in 1996 for the abduction and murder of a gas station clerk in Tallahassee. The case had always seemed unrelated, until now. Raymond had no known connection to Ashwood. No family. No travel records. No arrest there. But his DNA was at Brandon's last known location. Suddenly, Brandon Keller's disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was part of something far darker, and far bigger, than anyone had imagined. A quiet town's oldest cold case had cracked wide open. But as investigators dug deeper, they realized Raymond Duval wasn't acting alone. And the real twist? The man who helped cover it up had been at Brandon's funeral. And he still lived in Ashwood. One tiny, overlooked piece of evidence sat untouched for decades, until a DNA hit finally exposed a killer who almost got away. The cigarette but had sat undisturbed in an evidence bag for 34 years. To the naked eye, it was just trash, a detail buried in a mountain of dead-end leads. But to Sheriff Eli Boudreau, it represented the last breadcrumb in a trail that had long since gone cold. In January 2021, Ashwood's Cold Case Initiative, sparked by a federal grant for retesting legacy forensic evidence, reopened the Keller file. When the DNA hit on Raymond Duval came back from CODIS, it sent shockwaves through the sheriff's office. Raymond Duval, convicted murderer, lifelong drifter, and until now, a ghost from another world. At first glance, there was no reason for Duval to be anywhere near Ashwood in 1987. His criminal record included armed robbery, assault, and ultimately a brutal murder in Florida in '96. But Ashwood? He had no family, no work history, no connection. Nothing. But DNA doesn't lie. Sheriff Boudreau knew he couldn't treat this as a closed case just because the killer was already behind bars. No, this was about justice for Brandon Keller. Justice that had taken nearly 4 decades to come knocking. Boudreau assembled a cold case task force. It included Deputy Rosa Lynn, Ashwood's first-ever digital forensics expert, and Tom Hollander, a retired detective who'd worked the original Keller case as a rookie in 1987. Tom hadn't touched the case in years, but he remembered Linda Keller's tear-stained face like it was yesterday. Together, the team began tracing Duval's movements in the '80s. They uncovered an old arrest record in Georgia from early 1987, misdemeanor trespassing. It was the first clue that placed him in the Southeast Corridor months before Brandon's disappearance. But then they found something stronger. A motel registry from Greensboro, North Carolina, dated May 14, 1987, just 4 days before Brandon vanished. The signature was messy but legible. R. Duval. Paid in cash. No license plate listed. It put him less than 90 miles from Ashwood. Duval was what the FBI calls a geographic transient predator. Someone who targets remote towns, travels under the radar, and blends into the fabric of quiet America. By the time authorities connect the dots, he's long gone. With each new file they pulled, Boudreau's team began to see the familiar signs. In small towns like Beaufort, Wilmington, and even rural parts of South Carolina, young men around Brandon's age had vanished in similar ways. Most were never found. None had connections to each other. But in almost every case, they were last seen alone at night, in or near parking lots, or walking home from work. The chilling part? Duval had never been suspected in any of them. Until now. The cold case unit submitted additional evidence from the Keller file for testing: Brandon's shirt fragment, found near the woods, and a partial hair follicle collected from the inside of his Dodge Dart. Within weeks, the lab confirmed it. The hair belonged to Raymond Duval. Brandon had been in direct contact with him. But the bigger question loomed: why? Why would Duval target a 19-year-old kid in a random town he'd never been to before? Unless it wasn't random. During the initial 1987 investigation, several individuals had been questioned, including Brandon's co-workers at Ollie's Diner. One name stood out to Deputy Rosa Lynn: Dennis Marshall. Dennis had been a line cook and friend of Brandon's. They'd worked the same shifts for over a year, carpooled occasionally, and were seen talking in the alleyway outside the diner multiple times the week of the disappearance. In 1987, Dennis was dismissed as a suspect after passing a polygraph. He told police he had gone straight home after his shift and had never seen Brandon again. There was no evidence to dispute it. But Rosa noticed something strange when reviewing the 1987 interview logs. Dennis had mentioned a cousin passing through town that week. When asked his name, Dennis hesitated and finally said Ray. The detail had gone unnoticed for decades. Could Ray have been Raymond Duval? Suddenly the pieces began to fit. Sheriff Boudreau requested an interview with Duval at Florida State Penitentiary. Surprisingly, Duval agreed. In March 2021, Boudreau and Rosa flew to Florida with a digital recorder, a list of carefully prepared questions, and Brandon Keller's photo. Duval was smug, grinning, as if he'd been waiting. When Boudreau asked if he remembered Ashwood, Duval said nothing. When asked if he'd ever met Brandon Keller, he stared at the photo for a long time and whispered, "He didn't deserve what happened to him." Then he leaned in and added, "But I wasn't the only one there." Boom. A confession, and a breadcrumb. Boudreau played it cool, knowing that pushing Duval could end the interview prematurely. They asked who else was involved, but Duval refused to say more. He wanted immunity. Wanted to negotiate before revealing the truth. They left Florida shaken but focused. Duval had just confirmed what Rosa and Tom suspected. Brandon didn't die because of a random predator. He died because someone he trusted, someone who worked beside him, lured the predator into town. Back in Ashwood, Sheriff Boudreau brought Dennis Marshall in for questioning. Now in his 50s, Dennis had lived a quiet, unassuming life. 2 kids. Divorced. Worked as a mechanic. Still lived in the same house he grew up in, less than 3 miles from where Brandon vanished. When asked about Duval, Dennis froze. Said he hadn't spoken to his cousin in decades. But when pressed about the week Brandon disappeared, his story cracked. Eventually, Dennis broke. Through tears, he admitted that Raymond had been staying with him in May 1987. That they'd been drinking. That Ray had a mean streak. But then came the bombshell. Dennis admitted he saw Ray and Brandon talking outside the diner that night. He claimed he went inside, and by the time he came back out, Brandon was gone. He said nothing to police because he was scared. That Duval threatened to kill him if he talked. That he'd carried the guilt for over 30 years. It wasn't enough for a murder charge. But it was enough to implicate him in a cover-up. And so, on April 4, 2021, Dennis Marshall was arrested and charged as an accessory to murder after the fact. Brandon Keller's case was no longer a mystery. It was a tragedy. One with 2 perpetrators, and a town forever changed. One killer sat behind bars. Another lived among them. But justice wasn't done yet. There was one last twist, and it would turn the case upside down. She was 84, legally blind, and had never spoken a word to police, until one moment of clarity shattered everything the town thought it knew. By the time the 2020s arrived, Brandon Keller's name had largely faded into the shadows of Ashwood's collective memory. New families had moved in. Kids played where posters once hung. But there were still a few people, like Mrs. Delilah Moreland, who remembered every chilling detail. Delilah lived 3 blocks from the alley behind Ollie's Diner, where Brandon was last seen alive. In 1987 she was 46, a homemaker, and often sat on her porch late into the night due to chronic insomnia. Her house directly overlooked the rear parking lot. But in the official records she had never been listed as a witness. Not once. Now 84, widowed, and nearly blind, Delilah had spent her later years in a nursing facility on the outskirts of Ashwood. Her memory had begun to slip, or so people thought. But in June 2021, just 2 months after Dennis Marshall's arrest, Delilah shocked her visiting granddaughter with a whispered sentence. "I saw him, that night. That boy. He was screaming." Startled, the granddaughter, Kara, pressed for more, but Delilah became agitated. Staff dismissed it as confusion. But Kara wasn't convinced. She dug through old family boxes, photo albums, even newspapers. What she found changed everything. A 1987 clipping about Brandon Keller's disappearance with a yellow sticky note that read, "Tell someone before I die." Kara took it straight to the Ashwood Sheriff's office. When Sheriff Boudreau and Deputy Rosa Lynn visited Delilah the next morning, she seemed hesitant, almost frightened. But when they gently explained that Brandon's case had reopened and they believed she might know something, her eyes moistened. "I heard shouting, not angry, scared. A car door slammed. I saw a tall man pull Brandon into the alley. He was yelling for help, and then I heard a second voice. They asked why she never came forward." Delilah looked out the window. "Because the second voice was someone I knew. Dennis, my nephew." The bombshell rocked the entire task force. Delilah Moreland was Dennis Marshall's aunt, and she had been sitting on this truth for 34 years. She admitted she'd been terrified. That Raymond Duval, whom she'd met once at a family cookout, terrified her. That Dennis begged her never to tell, insisting it was an accident. That Brandon got into something he shouldn't have. That if she spoke she'd be next. But the guilt had festered. And now at 84, Delilah had nothing left to lose but the truth. Her testimony, recorded, transcribed, and backed by the 1987 newspaper clipping she'd saved, would become the case's turning point. Delilah's description of the vehicle, an old brown station wagon, matched a car registered to Dennis's father at the time. This car had never been connected to Brandon's disappearance in the original investigation. Sheriff Boudreau sent a request to impound records in the region, and incredibly, the car had been junked but not crushed in 1988. It was located on a lot in Raleigh, rusted but intact. A forensic team was dispatched. Inside, embedded deep in the seams of the backseat cushion, they discovered trace blood remnants, barely enough to swab. Modern DNA testing took weeks, but the results were conclusive. It was Brandon Keller's blood. That sealed it. With Delilah's statement, the DNA from the car, and Dennis's own half-confession from earlier questioning, the case was reopened for prosecution. A grand jury was convened in early September 2021. The charges against Dennis Marshall were elevated to felony second-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. But that wasn't all. Delilah's testimony included something else, a chilling detail she had kept hidden for decades. Dennis told me, Brandon was going to tell, about something that happened at the diner, with the manager, with others, said he had to be shut up. Suddenly, a new and sinister layer was added to the case. What had Brandon known? And who else was involved? Tom Hollander, the retired detective on the cold case team, recalled whispers during the original 1987 investigation. That Ollie's Diner had a seedy undercurrent. That the manager, Dale Thurman, had faced anonymous complaints of sexual harassment. But nothing ever stuck. Now, with Brandon possibly acting as a whistleblower, everything came into question. Had his murder been part of a larger effort to silence him? Had Dennis been more than a panicked accomplice? Had Duval been hired to do more than just scare Brandon? Suddenly, the case had grown beyond revenge, beyond impulse, into a possible conspiracy. Pressed with the weight of new evidence and Delilah's testimony, Dennis folded. In an exclusive recorded confession, he revealed the final truth. Brandon had witnessed Dale Thurman, the diner manager, assaulting a teen employee in the storage room. He threatened to go to the police. Dale panicked and pulled Dennis aside. Dennis, fearing for his job and reputation, called Raymond, his estranged cousin and ex-con, begging him to scare the kid. Raymond arrived the next day. Things escalated quickly. Brandon fought back. There was yelling, struggling. Then Raymond hit him. Hard. Brandon's head hit the pavement. He didn't get up. Dennis claimed it wasn't planned, that it wasn't supposed to end that way. But they hid the body in the forest, deep into the preserve, where animals likely scattered the remains over time. None of that excused what happened. But at last, Brandon's family had the truth. 34 years after a teenager vanished without a trace, the pieces finally came together. Thanks to an old woman's memory, a decades-old photo, and a choice to speak up when it mattered most. Justice might have come late, but it did come. And now, with Brandon's story finally being told, one question remained. Who else knew the truth and stayed silent all these years? Buried behind a fake wall in a forgotten storage room were files that had the power to expose everything and everyone. When Dennis Marshall's confession implicated Dale Thurman, the former manager of Ollie's Diner, as a central figure in Brandon Keller's murder, the cold case team knew they had to dig deeper. Dale had left Ashwood in 1990, 3 years after Brandon's disappearance, and had since passed away in 2012. At the time of his death, Dale was living in Arizona under a different name, David Thorne. It looked like the trail had gone cold again. But one building still stood unchanged since 1987, the original Ollie's Diner. Though shuttered after a food violation scandal in 1993, the building had been purchased by a real estate holding company and left to rot. The back storage room, the one Brandon allegedly caught Dale abusing a teen in, remained untouched for nearly 3 decades. And what they found there would confirm every terrible suspicion. Detective Rosa Lynn, now leading the reopened investigation, secured a warrant and organized a small forensic team to re-enter the abandoned diner. The space was a time capsule. Dust layered thick, furniture collapsed from termite rot, and kitchen equipment rusted into uselessness. The back hallway leading to the staff area reeked of mildew and decay. But it was the manager's office that told the story. A metal cabinet had been pushed in front of the back wall, strangely heavy for its size. When they moved it aside, they found a hollowed-out panel. Behind it, a false wall. Hidden within were 2 crates of file folders, cassette tapes, and old film canisters. And on the inside of the panel was a name written in marker. Private, DD only. The documents were chilling. Each folder was labeled with a year, spanning from 1983 to 1989. Inside were handwritten logs, names, timesheets, photographs, and even confidentiality agreements signed by teenage staff members. The logs detailed troubling behavior, late-night meetings, disciplinary sessions, and dozens of references to minors. There were even pages with initials next to dollar amounts. One of the logs from May 1987 referenced BK, getting loud. Needs to be taken care of. Talk to DM. BK was Brandon Keller. DIM, Dennis Marshall. Detectives were stunned. These weren't just disturbing notes. They were evidence of a coordinated pattern of predatory abuse and hush tactics stretching across several years. Even worse were the cassette tapes. Many were unmarked, but some had dates and initials scrawled in fading pen. When authorities carefully digitized them, what emerged was nauseating. Hours of grainy recordings, conversations with teen employees, threats of firing if they talked, and recordings of Dale's coercive interviews. One tape, from June 4, 1987, just 5 days before Brandon's disappearance, included a chilling statement from Dale himself. He thinks he's a hero. Thinks people are gonna believe him over me? No. I've been running this place too long. Kid needs to be taught a lesson. The voice matched Dale's from an older video clip obtained from a 1986 Chamber of Commerce meeting. The match was undeniable. With the files, logs, and tapes now in hand, it became clear. Dale Thurman had run a predatory operation under the cover of a family restaurant. He used threats, money, and manipulation to silence vulnerable teens. Brandon Keller, brave and idealistic, had refused to be quiet. And it cost him his life. The accident, Dennis described, had now taken on a new weight. Brandon wasn't just a kid in the wrong place at the wrong time, he was a whistleblower, a target, a threat to a hidden empire of abuse. The state prepared to charge Dennis Marshall with first-degree murder, upgraded from second-degree. And though Dale Thurman was dead, law enforcement opened an official posthumous investigation into his crimes. As media reports began to cover the reopened Keller case and the secret files found in Ollie's diner, former employees started coming forward. Quietly at first, through anonymous tips, emails, and voice messages left on a new hotline the sheriff's office had set up. But within a week, 7 individuals from the 1980s reported that they had also been assaulted or coerced by Dale Thurman. 3 of them recalled Brandon Keller. He was the only one who stood up, one said. He told me to speak out, but I was scared. Then he disappeared. And I always wondered if it was my fault. Another victim, now 49, admitted, I saw Dennis in the alley once talking to Brandon. They were arguing. I kept walking. I didn't know what I was seeing. The town of Ashwood, long buried in ignorance and silence, was now on the edge of national attention. True crime podcasts, local news stations, and eventually even national media outlets swarmed the small town. CNN and NBC did specials on the Diner Files. Documentarians approached the Keller family for exclusive interviews. Sheriff Boudreaux, cautious but transparent, held weekly press briefings to control the narrative and protect victims. He publicly praised the bravery of Delilah Moreland and the victims now coming forward. But he also made a stunning announcement. We are investigating the possibility that more than one murder occurred. We are combing through missing persons reports from 1985 through 1990 to ensure no other young people vanished under similar circumstances. Ashwood was no longer just the town where a teen vanished in 1987. It was now the epicenter of a decades-long cover-up, and the community was demanding answers. Brandon Keller's name became a symbol of courage. Memorials were held. A mural was painted outside the newly refurbished youth center. Local schools began incorporating lessons on speaking out and reporting abuse. But for the Keller family, especially his younger brother Jason, it was bittersweet. He never got to go to college. Never got to start a family. But maybe now, his truth will help save others. And for Ashwood, the wounds were still fresh. The realization that trusted adults, law enforcement, and town officials may have looked away for decades left scars. But finally, the town had something it hadn't had in over 30 years. The truth. The courtroom had heard thousands of cases, but never one where justice waited over 3 decades to arrive. The people of Ashwood packed the courtroom in eerie silence the morning the trial began. It was May 6, 2024, 36 years after Brandon Keller vanished into the summer night. For many in town, this was more than a murder trial. It was the public reckoning of everything they'd refused to believe for decades. A beloved family restaurant had been the site of repeated abuse. A teenager had died trying to expose it. And now the man accused of silencing him sat shackled in a charcoal suit, his hair gone gray, his eyes fixed on the wood grain table before him. Dennis Marshall, 59 years old, looked nothing like the lanky dishwasher described in the original 1987 reports. Years of guilt and isolation had hollowed him. Yet no one could forget the words he uttered during his police interview 9 months earlier. "I didn't mean to kill him. But he left me no choice." Now, the state of North Carolina was seeking a conviction for first-degree murder, and the jury would decide whether the past could finally be held accountable. District Attorney Valerie Kim, sharp and unrelenting, stood before the 12 jurors and painted a chilling picture. This is not just the story of a young man killed in a moment of panic. This is the story of a cover-up, carefully constructed by a predator and carried out by those too scared to resist. Brandon Keller was silenced because he dared to expose the truth. She presented the timeline: Brandon's confrontation with Dale Thurman, the midnight meeting behind the diner, the sudden disappearance, and Dennis's long-withheld confession. She introduced the most damning evidence: the tapes, files, and handwritten logs recovered from the hidden office. Highlighted was the phrase, "BK, getting loud. Needs to be taken care of." That single line, prosecutors said, proved premeditation. Not by Dennis alone, but by Dale Thurman, who used Dennis as the instrument of silence. But defense attorney Russell McKay, a seasoned litigator known for handling high-profile reversals, countered with a sharp angle. "My client was manipulated. He was a scared teenager, threatened and used by an abusive employer. This case is about survival, not malice." McKay argued that Dennis acted out of fear, not murder. Dale Thurman, who conveniently died before he could be brought to justice, was the true villain. He had orchestrated Brandon's death, and Dennis had merely panicked during a confrontation gone wrong. The heart of the trial, McKay said, was intent. Was Dennis Marshall a cold-blooded killer? Or was he an impressionable 20-year-old caught in a nightmare he never wanted to be part of? One by one, former employees of Ollie's Diner took the stand. Their accounts of Dale Thurman's abuse were consistent and heartbreaking. One woman, now 51, broke into tears describing how she was forced to sign a silence agreement at age 16 after Dale made unwanted advances. Another testified that Brandon was the only person who had ever stood up to Dale, and that he openly warned her, "He's going to hurt someone." Then came the forensic experts. They verified that the tapes and logs recovered from the office were authentic and had not been altered. Analysts confirmed that the voice threatening Brandon in the 1987 tape belonged to Dale Thurman. Finally, the prosecution introduced Jason Keller, Brandon's younger brother. Now 47, Jason took the stand with shaking hands and a voice full of pain. "My brother was more than a case file. He was kind. He protected people. And for 36 years I lived without answers. All we ever wanted was the truth. And now we finally have it." But the most explosive moment of the trial came on day 11, when the prosecution revealed an overlooked piece of evidence. Inside one of the cassette cases had been a receipt, dated June 8, 1987. It was a handwritten invoice from a local landscaping company that listed removal of one large soil patch, 3:45 a.m., back lot behind diner. The prosecution argued that it was proof the body had been buried there briefly, before being moved. It confirmed that Dale had planned the cleanup, reinforcing that Brandon's death was no accident. Dennis, who had been silent throughout the trial, buried his face in his hands. The courtroom was stunned. D.A. Kim made her final appeal. For 36 years, Brandon's voice was silenced. But now, with the voices of the victims, the evidence, and the truth unearthed from the shadows, justice has a chance to be heard. Don't let another decade pass without it. McKay, in his closing, pleaded with the jury to show compassion. Dennis Marshall was not the mastermind. He was the weapon. He lives every day with what happened. That is a sentence in itself. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. The town of Ashwood waited with bated breath. At 9:43 p.m., the bailiff handed the envelope to the judge. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Dennis Marshall, guilty of second-degree murder." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Not the first-degree charge the state had pushed for, but still a conviction. Dennis showed no visible reaction. Just a quiet nod. He was sentenced to 22 years to life, with parole possible after 18. Given his age and prior record, he would likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The verdict didn't erase the pain. It didn't bring Brandon back. But for Jason, for Delilah Moreland, and for the other survivors who once feared no one would believe them, it was something. A signal that silence had finally lost its grip on Ashwood. Outside the courthouse, a candlelight vigil began. Old classmates of Brandon gathered, holding photos from 1987 with signs that read, "His voice matters. We remember Brandon. Justice at last." It sat in a sealed drawer for over 3 decades, never mailed, never opened. Inside it was the one thing that could shatter everything the town thought it knew. 3 weeks after Dennis Marshall was convicted, Jason Keller received a phone call that sent chills down his spine. The voice on the other end belonged to Angela Kim, a former librarian at Ashwood High School. "Jason, we've found something." It was in an old school records box. "It's addressed to you, dated May 1987. This, from Brandon." Jason's breath caught. A letter? His brother had written him something, just weeks before he vanished? Angela explained that the letter had likely been handed in to be mailed through the school's internal outreach program, where students with siblings could write notes or letters of encouragement and staff would mail them on their behalf. But this one had slipped through the cracks, and it had just surfaced after 36 years. Jason held the letter in his hands that evening in silence, sitting at the dining table he'd shared with his brother decades ago. The envelope was brittle. The paper inside had yellowed at the edges, but Brandon's handwriting was unmistakable, neat, careful, the lowercase always looped like a music note. The letter read, "Hey Jay, I know I don't always say it, but I'm proud of you. You're the only one who ever made me laugh when things sucked. I've been seeing some stuff at the diner, bad stuff. Things that shouldn't be happening. I'm thinking about telling someone. I know it's risky, but someone has to stop it. I don't want you to worry, okay? If anything ever happens, I need you to know I did what I thought was right. If I make it out of this town, I'll take you with me. Promise. Keep being a light, Jay. Love you always, Bran." Jason couldn't move for minutes. His hands trembled. The letter was everything: validation, farewell, warning, and love. The letter was turned over to investigators, who authenticated it quickly. While it wouldn't alter Dennis's conviction, it would serve another purpose. It was probable cause. Within 2 weeks, Ashwood police reopened multiple unsolved missing persons reports from 1984 to 1988, all involving teenage employees at Ollie's Diner. One girl, Clara Henley, had disappeared a year before Brandon. 2 others, Melissa Raines and Thomas Vega, were listed as runaways. Now, with Brandon's letter describing bad stuff, and the hidden audio tapes from Dale Thurman, authorities believe those disappearances may have been part of a larger pattern, one Brandon might have uncovered. Brandon's voice wasn't just bringing justice for his own murder. It was becoming the catalyst for truth far beyond his own story. On August 11, 2024, what would have been Brandon's 56th birthday, Ashwood held a memorial event at Pine Creek Park. Hundreds gathered. Candles flickered in glass jars. Local musicians played one of Brandon's favorite songs, "I Won't Back Down" by Tom Petty. A plaque was unveiled under the maple tree where Brandon used to study on warm afternoons. Brandon Keller, 1968 to 1987. He stood for truth when silence was easier. May his voice never be forgotten. Jason stood before the crowd, holding the letter. "For 36 years, I lived in the shadow of unanswered questions. But now I know my brother never backed down, not once. He did the right thing. And now, finally, we're doing the same." In the months that followed the trial, Ashwood began its own reckoning. The diner was shut down permanently. The building was condemned and set for demolition. A former waitress, now in her 60s, opened a support group for survivors of workplace abuse. It was named Brandon's Voice, and quickly gained members from across the state. New laws were proposed in North Carolina that would require tighter record-keeping and background checks for businesses hiring minors. The Keller Protection Bill, as it was informally named, was fast-tracked in the state assembly. Brandon's story, long buried beneath silence and shame, had become a movement. Psychologists reviewing the case noted a disturbing pattern in Dale Thurman's behavior: grooming, coercion, and control. His predatory methods fit classic profiles, but he was shielded by his position in the community. No charges could be filed posthumously, but a civil suit was launched by multiple families against his estate, which had quietly passed to an estranged niece in 2014. In one deposition, a survivor said, "We never thought anyone would believe us. Then Brandon spoke up and paid for it. Now the world finally sees who Dale really was." Jason eventually donated Brandon's letter, the tapes, and his journal to the North Carolina Museum of Justice under a special exhibit titled, Whispers That Broke the Silence, the Brandon Keller Case. The exhibit includes audio recordings, with permission, a recreation of the hidden office, and a digital archive where visitors can hear testimonies from other survivors. Jason's goal? To make sure no one forgets. Not just Brandon, but every voice that was ignored, silenced, or buried. It took 36 years, a forced confession, and one lost letter to unearth the truth. But in the end, Brandon Keller's voice did what the town of Ashwood never dared. It exposed a predator. It sparked justice. And it lit the way for others to come forward. Brandon Keller's voice may have been silenced in 1987, but decades later, it still brought the truth roaring back. How many voices like his are still waiting to be heard? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more haunting cases, unsolved mysteries, and shocking twists that expose what others tried to bury. And remember, justice may sleep, but it never forgets.